Take one, take one.
Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our discussions of the feature film works directed by the one, the only, David Cronenberg. That brings us to that work which is from 1979, and I think in many ways it is highly regarded as being one of the most supreme, if not perfect, examples of what might be termed the cinematic aesthetic of David Cronenberg. And I am, of course, speaking of this work which has so many powerful and brilliant aspects to it. It is this film, 1979's The Brood. The discussion I'd like to have now is a very general one, and we will maybe continue in a separate video discussion regarding the specifics of the work The Brood. So if you haven't seen the film The Brood yet, don't worry, because I will be making sure that my comments maintain a sense of generality so as not to go into specifics. So if you haven't seen The Brood yet, and you are okay with this kind of, say, horror film, because it can be described as a horror film. It can be described as it being a very intense film with certain very intense scenes included within it. However, if you are okay with that, then I can strongly recommend the film The Brood. It is, as I mentioned earlier, it can be described as being one of the most supreme examples of the craft of David Cronenberg. Again, to maintain a sense of generality, but also try to describe it in a way that might entice those who might be interested in watching it. This film could be said to be, again, about many things, just like many other works of Cronenberg. It is a film that is about, in many ways, a very intense relationship or relationship issue. This is in terms of the characters, certain main characters that are undergoing maybe an intense type of breakup or relationship breakdown. And when this occurs between two people who have hitherto been intimate, that of course causes a sense of pain, causes a sense of confusion, it causes a sense of how to deal with the other person after the dissolution of the relationship or after the breakup of the relationship or marriage, whatever the case may be. And also what plays into this specific situation here is that there's also a child, and also how the child, the daughter, how she is handling this specific situation of a relationship breakdown or dissolution, and how she is handling the apparent emotional stakes that are at play here in the context of this relationship dissolution. Now, this is not the only thing that's happening here in The Brood as well, because we also have the idea of a sense of, say, anger or rage, or a type of expression of emotion or rage or pent-up frustration as a means of, say, psychological therapy, as a means of a type of medicinal therapy, as a means of bettering the body and mind and spirit. This is the component of the doctor or medicine aspect of The Brood, and it is given the phrase here, psychoplasmics. Now, you have this concept here of a type of, say, psychoanalytical approach to the betterment of the mind and spirit and body by virtue of some kind of role play, some kind of anger management, and some kind of a primal scream type of a related therapy, as a means of, as I say, bettering the body, of remedying some kind of trauma, emotional trauma, or maybe expressing some kind of frustration that will, in a maybe an emotional and a psychological way, exorcise whatever feeling that is within one, in order to cure whatever ailment exists. So this is another aspect of that. Now, we have these two components, the dissolution of relationships and then the idea of the psychoplasmics, and you combine them together and you create also the sense of a mystery, because there are also these killings that are occurring throughout the landscape of the film The Brood here in Canada. And these killings seem to be related to the members of this particular relationship, and also the institute regarding which this therapy of psychoplasmics, or this theory of psychoplasmics, is being tested and is being actually experimented upon. And we have these killings that are occurring with various other characters that we meet along the way. And whether there is a connection or not, we must watch the film to try to figure that out. What those killings are rooted in, who is actually participating in these very violent acts, and why they are occurring the way they are occurring, and also what is the physical or transmutational or transhuman or evolutionary or even Darwinian connotation to these killings and to the perpetrators of these crimes, because, as I say, it is all connected in terms of this great unit and circle and a wonderful tableau and display that is on the stage here in the mind of David Cronenberg in the form of this brilliant film, The Brood. So there is so much here that is going on. The mystery builds upon mystery builds upon mystery. Of course, if one goes about reading, say, reviews or synopses of the film prior to watching the film, I think one can get a sense of what might be going on. However, I would encourage you, as I say, if you are okay with this type of, say, a film with intense scenes of horror and violence, and if you are okay with the works of David Cronenberg, and if you haven't seen The Brood yet, then this is, I think, one of the key works. This is one of the key works of Cronenberg, again, for some of the reasons that I try to touch upon in this discussion, but also just say in say production terms, and also in terms of the general themes and concerns that are, I would suggest, part of The Brood. Now, let's speak about the production terms. So, for example, we have a number of production members, crew members, artistic collaborators who we will see to be very key in the world of Cronenberg. So, for example, we have Mark Irwin behind the camera, and the aesthetic of the director of photography, Mark Irwin, is very important. The cinematography, this will be very important carrying through, this is 1979, carrying through into the 1980s, and what might call the Cronenberg aesthetic, the visual aesthetic of the 1980s, up to a certain point anyway. And so this is a very, very important collaboration. And so we see this collaboration continuing on. And then also we have the emergence of Howard Shore, the music. This is also very, very important indeed. There is a driving, almost a very unnerving aspect to the way that the themes are being evolved here, or dissolved here, depending on one's perspective, perhaps. But one of the ways that evolution or dissolution is being further perpetuated is by virtue of the brilliant application of the music, Howard Shore. And as we know, too, the relationship between David Cronenberg and Howard Shore in terms of cinema and music is one of the key components of Cronenberg's films that will be carried through in a very rich and significant way from here on out. So here we have one of the great scores in the world of Cronenberg in the hands of Howard Shore. And also we have, too, in terms of the themes and concerns of the films, which are things that I tried to touch upon very lightly before. So we have the idea of evolution or transhumanism, or the idea of a progression or development of the human body, or the existential nature of the human identity, the human consciousness. And so here we have aspects of a type of change of human form. And now the question or query that I think is posited to the audience members of the film The Brood is whether or not those motions or movements of an evolutionary nature that we see here in The Brood, whether those evolutionary steps could be said to be beneficial or they could be said to be detrimental to the notion of human existence. I think we've seen in previous examples of the great filmography of Cronenberg, we've seen, for example, in, say, Rabid or Shivers or Stereo, Crimes of the Future. We've seen, for instance, how these steps in an evolutionary or transhumanism nature, they could be said to be maybe beneficial in the sense that maybe they are naturally or they are innate in terms of they are maybe a reaction, or they are things that cannot be controlled by some kind of human consciousness. They are things that maybe are done beyond the direct will of the participant or actor in question. They might have certain third-party consequences, and horrific consequences, perhaps, as we've seen maybe in films like Shivers and Rabid as an example. But all the same, we have seen a type of almost innocence or naivete when it comes to these steps of an evolutionary nature. And in that way, one can interpret, in those forms anyway, those forms of those films, the steps of evolution as expressed in those films as being not necessarily detrimental, not necessarily malevolent. Here in The Brood, one can, I think, change that or see a variation on the question. Namely, are the steps of evolution and transhumanism that we see expressed in the story of The Brood, can they be said to be beneficial, or are they in fact detrimental, or even more extremely, could they be said to be malevolent? And if that's the case, then here we have arguably one of the first examples of the way in which the evolutionary spirit or transhumanism, as expressed in the specific plot aspects of The Brood, could be said to have a very almost villainous or dangerous or even almost deadly nature on purpose. On purpose, and I think that is the key. Now, whether or not that on-purpose aspect can be appropriately applied in terms of one's interpretation of the film, this is something that I'd like to talk about when we get into maybe specific aspects of the film The Brood. But be that as it may, for now, let me say that I think those questions are there, as well as other questions too about of a sort of a socio-political nature as well, which we have also seen in past works of Cronenberg, that we also see in future works of Cronenberg. And here we have the law, we have the idea of relationship dissolution, divorce, and we also have the notion of child custody, and what are deemed to be, at the time anyway, default let's say, default preferences in the law, and how that might be consistent with or in contravention to the actual situation on the ground, as it were. And so there are some very fascinating discussions of gender roles too, as they are expressed, as I say, in the law, as they are interpreted by the characters in question. Also gender roles in the context of psychoplasmics, and how gender roles in certain instances can be said to be, in the hands of the characters here, treated in a way that might be said to be demeaning one gender over the other, whereas with other characters we see that reversed. And so we have this very fascinating interplay in terms of the handling of gender roles depending on the characters that we have encountered here, and therefore the variation in this type of handling in terms of a dominant or subordinate role, if one applies those roles, which we also saw in films like Stereo, if you recall. This type of variation and interplay and reversal of roles, as it were, creates, I think, a very rich and very complex, foundation upon which gender roles, I think, are being examined here in the film The Brood. So that's another very key component. And gender roles, we know, have been explored in prior Cronenberg works. I mentioned Stereo. There's also Crimes of the Future, and also Rabid too. Shivers and Rabbit, and also we will see gender roles explored in future works beyond the Brood. So this is a very key component, again, part of the Cronenberg aesthetic overall. And I think too, we can see also, so there's evolution, there's also the handling of gender roles, and there's also too the way in which the elements of horror, the elements of quote unquote genre, are being employed here. They are very visceral, they are very direct, they are very shocking in many ways, but they are always done with a sense of, say, a purpose and a sense of a type of Cronenberg philosophy, as it were. And there's also the way in which the information, which is one of the things I really love about Cronenberg works, information is never directly presented. It is always presented in a way, almost in a piecemeal fashion, in a way that we as viewers are also asked by the filmmakers to piece together the pieces of the puzzle, to in fact go along with the mystery. So we must investigate as the characters in the film investigate going forward. So this is, I think, a really great example of this, the way in which information is withheld or shown to us throughout the course of the film. And even by the end of the film, one takes a step back and realizes what's going on. And even then, after the fact, one is trying to piece together what's going on. I think that's a really fascinating and powerful aspect of this and other works of Cronenberg, which is very much how information is presented. And then finally, of course, or not finally, but maybe another theme to touch upon before we can go into the other video is the idea of maybe medicine, and also the idea of the human condition, the human body. I mentioned it in the context of evolution, but even outside of that context, just strictly in the context of the human condition and the existential nature of the human condition, what it means to have a relationship between one's spirit and one's body, the physical versus the ethereal versus the corporeal, or not versus, but the ethereal and the corporeal. In other words, the sort of the spiritual and also the physical. And there could always be a type of a congruence, or there could always be a conjunction or a unity between the two. There could also be a violent reaction against the two. And sometimes that violent reaction, whether or not in the context of evolution or regardless, that reaction can itself be the source of the quote-unquote horror that we are often privy to when we watch films like The Brood. And it's not just the horror of the actual, say, reaction itself, but also the way in which the characters react, the emotional stakes that are at play. You know, in the hands of Cronenberg, the quote-unquote horror genre film of a Cronenberg film there is the visceral and physical attributes of that, of course, but it is also a very, very key component, which is how the characters are being affected on a spiritual and emotional level. And we see here the potential for these very extreme situations causing a potentially extreme effect on the characters here. And that extreme effect is, I think, again, physical, and it is also emotional. So it has that sense of the spiritual and also the sense of the corporeal or the body-based. And so this is very important because one of the key components of The Brood is, of course, the special effect scenes, these very quite striking and memorable scenes. And also in combination with that, we have the importance and the significance of how these events are affecting the characters. And are they affecting the characters in a beneficial way, or maybe in a somewhat dark and potentially quite disturbing way? And when we then return to the idea of relationships and relationship breakdowns and child custody, and even the very disturbing possibility of things like abuse and physical abuse and child abuse, we can see how these metaphors that we have applied in the context of Cronenberg works, they can be applied in a way that remind us of the horrors of the everyday, or the potential horrors of the everyday. And this type of concern or thematic exploration at the heart of the film of The Brood, I think, creates this sense of a film that is discussing many things at once. It is a genre film. It is a Cronenberg horror film. It is also a Cronenberg film whose aesthetic is, as I say, expressing many things at once. And that is one of the strengths of this film. And we will talk about it further in a separate video. But for now, this is the film The Brood.